The Runaway Scrape by Carol Beecham. The Runaway Scrape refers to the panic that ensued after the Texans learned about the fall of the Alamo. Upon learning of this news, fear and desperation took over. Some settlers had even left earlier as they had anticipated trouble from the Mexican army. The colonists felt they had no choice but to drop everything and run for their lives to the Louisiana border. The Mexican army was coming, and they were sure to be killed. The fall of the Alamo on March 6th was the catalyst for the Runaway Scrape. After a 13-day siege, the Mexicans were able to breach the north wall and gain access to the compound, awakening many of the sleeping Texans. The Texans were completely outnumbered and were overcome after 90 minutes of fighting. There were few survivors, which were mostly women, children, and slaves. Roughly 200 Texan defenders died that day, including James Bowie, William Travis, and Davy Crockett. Even those few who surrendered were executed by order of Santa Anna. General Sam Houston was at his camp in Gonzales about a week later when Susanna Dickinson, a survivor of the Alamo, came with a letter of warning from Santa Anna that read all who opposed him would suffer the fate of those at the Alamo. This confirmed the reports that the Alamo had fallen. This was a heavy blow to the settlers of Gonzales. Every family there had lost a loved one or someone they knew. Captain John Sharp, who was one of Houston's officers, recalls the scene that night. For several hours after the receipt of the intelligence, not a sound was heard, save the wild shrieks of the women and the heart-rending screams of the fatherless children. Upon receiving the terrible news, Sam Houston decided the best course of action would be to retreat as soon as possible. Before they left, the Texans threw their artillery in the river and set the town ablaze to prevent the Mexican army from getting possession of it. Most of the settlers left with Houston's army just a few hours after learning of their loved one's death. Houston led the families away before the soldiers burned their homes. All were headed toward the Colorado River. Captain John Sharp, who was a member of the burning party, later recalled, "'Twas a scene the like of which I have never before or since have witnessed. I entered several houses and found the beds yet warm, on which the inhabitants had but a short time before laid down, full of confidence and hope, and from which they had been awakened by the wild tocsin of alarm and had fled, leaving all they had been for years collecting, all for which they had braved the dangers of the wilderness, all, everything they had, whilst they themselves fled they knew not whither, probably many of them without a dollar or a friend on earth." As Houston's army moved east and word spread about the Mexican army's advancement, other families began to flee as well, which resulted in a mass exodus at the same time. One such family was the Rose family, who lived near Stafford's Point in Fort Bend County. On March 12th, a courier brought a dispatch to them from General Houston for the families to leave. Deleu Rose was a young girl at the time when her family ventured on this arduous journey. Later in life, she wrote her memoirs of the Runaway Scrape, which have been published in a book called Life in Early Texas, The Reminiscences of Mrs. Deleu Harris. Her family journeyed 60 miles from their home to Liberty, crossing the San Jacinto and Trinity Rivers along the way. Families from the same neighborhood would band together to make the journey. Most of the men had left to join Houston's army, leaving mostly women, children, servants, and slaves on their own during this frightening time. That March, the Texas weather was unrelenting. Their wagons were constantly getting stuck in the mud. That is, if they were lucky enough to have a wagon, since they were in very short supply. The following is a quote from one of the soldiers. "Delicate women trudged from day to day until their shoes were literally worn out, then continued the journey with bare feet, lacerated and bleeding at almost every step. Their clothes were scant, and with not means of shelter from frequent drenching rains and bitter winds, they traveled on through the long days in wet and bedraggled apparel. The wet earth and angry sky offered no relief. When the Rose family arrived at San Jacinto in the night, there were 5,000 people waiting for the ferry. A riot almost broke out because everyone was trying to cross first. The Lewis family was able to cross after 3 days of waiting. Things didn't get much better when they later reached the Trinity River. DeLue further says, "The horrors of crossing the Trinity are beyond my powers to describe." The river was rising and there was a struggle to see who could cross first. Measles, sore eyes, whooping cough, and every other disease that man, woman, or child is heir to broke out among us. One of DeLue's little sisters was very sick, which allowed them to cross before others. They were surrounded by water when they reached the boat, as the waters had broken out of the bank above where they were. The river was full of driftwood, and her little sister started having convulsions. When they landed, the lowlands were flooded, and everybody was making way for the prairie. At one point, they crossed a bridge that was under water. As soon as they crossed, a man with a team of oxen crossed, causing the bridge to collapse and drowning the animals. DeLue and her family made it to the prairie and were able to dry out. Other families were stuck in the bottomlands during the night without fire, food, and water up in their carts. These people were stuck in the bottomland. The men that were there built a raft to bring the women and children out of the bottoms, one family at a time. They had to bring food and provisions to the ones stuck there. After getting the people out, they had to bring out bedding and clothes which were soaked with water. Lastly, they brought the wagons and carts over, which had to be dismantled to cross. It took 4 days to bring everything out. Next, the family camped 3 miles from the town of Liberty, where they endured more hardship at the passing of DeLue's little sister. They stayed in this area a while, getting some much-needed rest. During that time, they received news that Fannin's men had been massacred at Goliad and the Mexican army had crossed the Brazos and was nearby. When the fighting broke out, they could hear the cannon firing. Not knowing the outcome, they quickly left Liberty, continuing their journey until they spotted a horseback rider headed toward them. The rider brought news from General Houston saying that the Mexicans had been defeated and it was safe to return home. On April 26th, they passed through the San Jacinto Battlefield, where they met up with other families they knew. General Santa Anna had been captured and held in the camp along with all of the Mexican prisoners. They visited the graves of the Texians that were killed in the battle. DeLue recalls seeing dead Mexican soldiers lying around in every direction. Peggy McCormick was a widow who owned the land where the battle had been fought. She was very unhappy about the presence of hundreds of corpses on her land and demanded that Houston remove them. Houston's response was, "Madam, your land will be famed in history as the classic spot upon which the glorious victory of San Jacinto was gained." Her response to that was, "To the devil with your glorious history." The Rose family started their trek home, which turned out to be a very treacherous one. After crossing the Trinity River, they had to cross a bayou that had no bridge. The only way to pass was to go 3 miles through the bay to get around the mouth of the bayou. While making this journey, the Rose family had to deal with quicksand and alligators. A few days before their arrival, another traveler by the name of King was attacked and killed by a large alligator while trying to cross the mouth of the bayou. Mr. King went underwater after being struck by the alligator's tail. To prevent the same fate from happening to others, the men waited several days before putting a beef quarter on the bank that was fastened by a chain. When the alligator took the bait, they shot and killed it. Many of the settlers had nothing to return home to. A lot of their homes had been burned either by Santa Anna's army or the Texans themselves in order to keep it out of the Mexicans' hands. Towns such as Gonzales and San Felipe de Austin were burned by the Texan army. Santa Anna burned Harrisburg, New Washington, and even Stafford's Point, located here in Fort Bend County, when his army crossed the Brazos River on April 11th. The only thing left of Stafford's Point was a crib with 1,000 bushels of corn. Thankfully, the Mexicans had saved the corn for bread, which was a great help to the surrounding families. Some of the settlers' homes had been robbed by looters. They would ride by the settlers' home during the onset of the panic and yell, "The Mexicans are coming!" to lure people away from their homes, even when the Mexican army wasn't close by. A lot of the settlers hid the belongings that they couldn't take with them away from their home. The Rose family hid a chest full of bedding, clothes, and other things, which was very useful when they returned, as all of their clothes were in ragged condition. The Rose family was fortunate that their home had not burned, but they found it in complete disarray upon arrival. Hogs running out of their house was the first thing they saw. Their bookcase had been overturned, and papers, medicines, and other things were scattered on the ground with the hogs sleeping on them. Every single family returning from the Runaway Scrape was low in provisions. All of their cattle had either been stolen by the Mexicans or had wandered off and were lost. Their crops in the field had also been destroyed. The settlers needed to start planting, but seed was hard to come by. I was reading how one settler had to travel 2 days and a night to buy seed corn from a farmer living near Bastrop. There was also much sickness going around. They were trying to rebuild their farms, which was hard physical labor, while their bodies were racked with fever and chills. There was also no money to be had after the war. Cows and calves were traded as currency for the same amount as their worth. DeLu Rose Harris immigrated in 1833 to Texas with her family. She turned 10 years old during the time of the Runaway Scrape. Her reminiscences are a combination of her own memories, stories she heard from other refugees throughout her life, and a diary her father, Pleasant Rose, kept. To learn more about DeLu's experience in colonial Texas, read her book Life in Early Texas, The Reminiscences of Mrs. DeLu Harris. The early settlers of Texas were tough. They had to be. Their hard work and sacrifice laid the groundwork for the great state of Texas we have today. Thank you for watching.